So welcome to session 3 of our study of Moses, this reluctant prophet of ours, and how he opens us up to understanding our own kind of relationship to God and our faith and to these powerful stories in our scripture. But before we go into kind of like what we're going to talk about today, which is a lot of stuff, familiar stuff, much of it, I want to just sort of say, all right, if this is like a mini series, what we're doing, let's just do a brief recap of what's been covered so far. So if you had to pick out sort of like the major pieces, some of the major components of what we'd covered so far in our story, what are some of the things you would say? Birdie?
Yes, last week we spoke about God calling himself I am. And the very next day in our Daily Bread devotionals, it talked about how in the Gospel of John, Jesus has 7 different I am statements.
That's right.
I am the good shepherd, I am the bread of life, etc. And it occurred to me that God is just making a statement. Jesus' ministry was about teaching, but God was just making a statement. I am. He is everything, all inclusive. He doesn't have to have descriptions put to him.
Yeah, and in a sense, the name I am, just by its nature, sort of, even though it doesn't define much, what it does is set apart and above. As you sort of just said, it's sort of like I am all that is. So there's not much. It's kind of like saying, oh, well, infinity plus 1. You know, it's like, okay, there's not much above that. You can't get above that. So that is the sort of sense of that the Israel's God's name sort of conveys that gravitas and that power above all other deities, which we'll see played out in our story today. Okay, so that's one thing. We had the naming of God before Moses when he was wandering in the desert. Carol, I saw your hand up. Is there what other piece would you add?
Reluctant hero, because we always think of all the wonderful things Moses does, but last week we were reminded, he kept saying, no, isn't there somebody else? I'm not ready for this job. I can't do it. You know, bring in Aaron and I need a buddy so I can accomplish this.
Yes. So he's sort of a well-practiced excuse maker, but that's a real important part of his story. And it's not to belittle him for that, but I think it's to allow us connection, as you said, to this powerful figure, this prophetic figure who has a lot of self-doubt. And as we saw last week, there's a lot of his excuses that do come across as kind of those legitimate, very human type excuses that I do think allows us a different entry point into the story. So yeah, we have this reluctant prophet who in the process of meeting God and being called by God demonstrates resistance and sort of conditions. What else? What other pieces have we covered? Bonnie.
That God used somebody that you would not expect, someone that came from a birth that was not, he ended up living in the palace, but he was not of the royal family and he was not someone you would expect. It kind of reminds me of Zelensky, who was a comedian, and now he's this leader of this country. I mean, God can use all of us, and he can certainly, no matter what your background or your family history or, any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So from humble, almost ridiculous beginning, that's not the right word, just sort of extreme beginning of humbleness and kind of just something that's very memorable story, a basket on a river kind of thing. But then from that point, that humble birth leading to a life of entry and access to power. Okay, so that's the beginning part of Moses' life. What happens after that? There's another significant event. Horty?
I was just thinking about the importance of each and every person and the action that they took upon themselves, the individual response to what was going on around them. If any one of those people had done something much different, but the whole story would have changed.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a good point. So from that beginning story, the birth story, the daughter of Pharaoh, even Moses' sister Miriam and his mother, all these little actions that are so significant. And that theme carries throughout the story. I didn't assign the whole readings for today. It's just too much, but it's wonderful, rich material, and you can just go ahead and read it. It's about 10 chapters, but you will go in and you'll see this continuation of these sort of characters that are almost like bit parts. But when you really stand back, it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That right there, if that hadn't happened, none of this happens. The story doesn't continue. That's so vital for our appreciation of not only the story, but our place in it. So that's a great sort of connector there. So is there one other event that you can think of, or any other events that you want to include, Marcia?
Well, to piggyback on that, it's like, why was he in a basket? It's because he's supposed to have died.
Yeah.
Supposed to have been killed. So, I mean, you have to go back to, he shouldn't have even existed.
Right. And that brings us, that actually sort of touches on the Joseph story that we started with. Remember that whole connector where Joseph has this crazy, amazing story, but that allows the establishment of Joseph and his brothers, so Israel, within Egypt. And the beginning of Moses' story is, oh, yeah, and now we're at this time where the Pharaoh has forgotten who Joseph was. So all bets are off, and we're seeing that. And as Marcia said, yeah, he's not even supposed to be there. So that's another just element of just God being able to work with what we would almost see as nothing, Jane?
Well, the burning bush and so much dialogue between God and Moses, that appeared to be quite audible to him, and
Yes.
and not just this feeling inside, but more audible. So to me, that was pretty significant.
Absolutely. So the even just the sense of relationship of God to Moses and by extension God to humanity, the Israelite conception, the Jewish conception of relationship to God is quite different than any other mythology or pantheon at that time. Now it changes later with Greece and Rome and stuff, but at this point, the relationship with God was never so personal as that. So that is quite a stunning development. There's one particular event that I just want to make sure we touch on, and it's kind of what precipitates him going to even meet God in the form of a burning bush while he's wandering around as a shepherd. What's the thing that drives him to go wander and become a shepherd? Carol?
He killed.
Yeah, it's so-called the awakening. Moses sort of emerges from his palace and sees what's really going on and is like, what? And he won't stand for it. And so he's a man of action. That's what that conveys. And yet he does something that causes him to have to flee. Okay, so that's an important piece. So those do really touch on it. You can see how, it's always this multivalent story that it's happening on the level of Moses and what his life and story arc is about and his relationship with God. But it also is always about us and our entry into it. Okay, so with that as a backdrop, let's continue on into what we're talking about today. It goes without saying that Exodus is the single most important story in the Hebrew Bible. These 10 chapters that cover what we're talking about today. And by Exodus, I'm specifically focusing on the 10 plagues that lead to the Passover and then the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, which is the more correct term than the Red Sea. Okay, but in terms of the actual Hebrew wording, but that story arc there, it's about 10 chapters. Okay, from 4 to 14 roughly in Exodus. And if you miss this story, you've basically missed the Old Testament. Okay, so it's that important. And it's this story about God choosing this enslaved people to be God's own people, and then using Moses as an instrument of liberation and moving them towards this place called the Promised Land. Okay. This is the single pivotal identity story within Judaism. And even modern Jews recount this story every day, at least the religious ones who are doing morning and evening prayer. References to this story are there. Every Sabbath, is a reference to this story when you do your prayers. The Passover Seder is obviously a reference to this story. It is so ingrained, this idea that once we had no one and then God chose us. And it's a powerful kind of statement, okay? God chose us. And it's also this deep conception that this story represents that God frees, God liberates, God has liberated us in the past, and God can do it again. Why is that important? Because scholarly consensus is that these stories that we're reading were not even written down until the Babylonian exile. Okay, they were oral traditions shared up until then. But when exile happened and identity was threatened, that's when these stories needed to be written down. Plus, it helped give people a sense of hope that God would do these liberating acts again. Because when you're stuck in exile, it can get hopeless quickly, or you can lose touch with your identity, which at that time was fairly, it was mostly related to their story. Rather than a sense of land. They were longing for land. They had land, but it's just at that point in exile, they didn't have their own space, their own land. So they wanted to return to that. So that's where it relates in Jewish identity. But it also invites us as Christians to think about what is it? Where do we connect to this story? We may not have ancestors who were literally enslaved. Some of us may. Some of us have shared that we have ancestors who were slave owners. But these stories invite us to think about what are the ways that I am in me, just folks start there. Where am I enslaved today? And where might God be seeking to liberate me? And paying attention to how that all happens can be really instructive for us as far as paying attention to the places of enslavement and potential for liberation. Because much like the Jewish conception, if God has done it before, God can do it again. Okay, so this is kind of what we're looking at. Today, we're going to look at, once again, Moses, this reluctant prophet, and his role in helping the Exodus happen. That's what we're going to look at. We're going to look pretty deeply at the 10 plagues and kind of get an understanding of them, and also encounter the parallels that exist between this redemption story, this Exodus story, and our own Christian redemption story. We'll look at that. And then we'll also kind of maybe reflect a little bit on some of the ways that we might respond to God's word as it's revealed in this story, what it might call us to do in our own circumstances. Okay, so that's sort of the introductory comments I have for today. Any initial questions or comments before we get to our readings? Bonnie?
Well, like we've mentioned before, these are all familiar stories, and you think you know everything about it. But the one thing that really struck me as I was reading was when it said God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And I guess I knew Pharaoh's heart was hardened, but I never thought God hardened his heart. And why would God do that? I didn't know God did that. You would think it would be the opposite, that God would, make him more empathetic or whatever. So that's a question of mine, and I hope you can answer that.
We will absolutely. We will be addressing that, because if you look closely, what you will see is the first 5 plagues, it says very specifically, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. The last 5 plagues, it says very explicitly, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, what it comes down to, in my estimation, is that it has to do with the word hardened. And once again, these Hebrew words that have 10 meanings, when we see translation, we get 1. So the word hardened, we think of quite specifically and precisely when it's a word that conveys many different meanings. And so it may just be that there's a movement here of what that word represents and what God's relationship is to it. But we will be talking about that because it's one that confounds people in much the same way that the story itself of the slaughter of the firstborns, it confounds people. We will talk about that too. We'll talk about that too. Any other questions or comments about the material? Ken?
In the Message, I like the way it says God said to Moses, go to Pharaoh. I made him stubborn, him and his servants, so I can force him to look at these signs. And so you'll be able to tell your children and grandchildren how I toyed with the Egyptians like a cat with a mouse. I love that imagery.
Yes. And I love it too, because anyone who's spent any time with Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, it's so poetic. This is the message itself. It's so poetic. And I really do think he does a good job capturing some of the elements that we often miss because we read these stories with such a solemnity. But there's a lightness, there's almost a mischievousness in the way he characterized that story, what Ken just shared with us. And I do think that is a tact that is quite helpful and appropriate, that there's a great deal of humor and it's over the top, what happens and the responses. And I think it's meant to be funny, partly because, remember, as we said first class, these stories are campfire stories. They're meant to be memorable and they have memorable elements so that we can convey them and just pass it on. And you want to hear the next part, you know, like any good campfire story. So it's really good to have that kind of meaning. But that idea that God is playing with them like a cat and a mouse, I think is instructive as we look more closely at the 10 plagues themselves. So much fun. This stuff is really fun, even though maybe you read it and you're like, I don't know, this isn't that fun. Partly, and part of why we respond to these stories the way we do is this. Look, depending on how you were raised and what type of church theology you have with stories, there are positions that are what I'll call maximalist or minimalist. And sort of like a maximalist approach would be like the kind that sort of reads these stories and says, well, this is historically and factually accurate and happened just like this. And that approach can really lead us to some difficult places, because it leaves us with a lot of questions and we can get stuck and bogged down in the details. But then there's a minimalist approach that sort of says, all of this is mythology and it's not really based on anything historical. And it's just our job is to find, the symbolic metaphorical meaning exclusively in it. And that certainly makes it easier to travel the roads of meaning because we don't get bogged down in some of the details. There's merits to both of these. And so where I tend to go is I like to try to find more of the middle path that sort of is like, what if these stories were intended to be, the idea like when we see a movie that's based on a real story. So it gives some poetic license, but it's based on certain things that did happen, that idea. So that's kind of the middle ground that I have. I don't tie all of it to history. Some of it is very plausible that it's historical. But as we've said, there's not a lot of evidence historically in documentation, in Egypt, that a lot of these things happened the way they're written. Okay, there might be little reference here or a vague reference there. And if we kind of like twist and turn and we can kind of do these gymnastics, then maybe we can say, oh yeah, see, they were there. I don't think it's that cut and dry. So it just takes some nuance. It takes some creativity to navigate these stories, but that'll be our tack, sort of that middle path there. Anyone else? Questions or comments before we get into reading? There are 4 potential passages today, 4 passages to read. So I'll need 4 readers. And one of them is very short, but I'm not going to tell you which one. So you have to just volunteer and maybe you'll get the short one, but maybe you really want the long one. So it's all good. It works out. But last week I did all the reading. So this week it's your turn. So just go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, Perry, number 1. Perry, number 2. No. So Perry is first. Who's second? Okay, Bonnie is second, then Horty is third, then Carol is fourth. Well done. Remember your positions. Let's see. Let's go to our readings. All right, Perry, this is you.
Doesn't look short.
Nope, you didn't get the short one, but it's not super long.
No, this is Exodus. Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons, put them on a donkey, and went back to the land of Egypt. and Moses carried the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he went, and he met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had sent him and all the signs with which he had charged him. Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the Israelites. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and performed the signs in the sight of the people. The people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had given heed to the Israelites and that he had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped.
Thank you. Bonnie, I believe you're next.
Okay.
Oh,
I got the short one, I think.
that's it.
Okay. Exodus 6, 1 and 2. Oops, am I muted?
That's
No.
it. Yeah.
Exodus 6, 1 and 2. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by the mighty hand he will let them go. By a mighty hand he will drive them out of his land." God also spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord."
Nice. Okay. Now, I think it was Horty. Yeah, Horty, you get the long one. I'll move it as you go.
Short straw, short straw. Exodus 11, 1 through 10. The Lord said to Moses, "I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you away. Tell the people that every man is to ask his neighbor, and every woman is to ask her neighbor for objects of silver and gold." The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, Moses himself was a man of great importance in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's officials, and in the sight of the people. Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the female slave who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Then there will be a loud cry throughout the whole land of Egypt, such has never been or ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl at any of the Israelites, not at people, not at animals, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all these officials of yours shall come down to me and bow low to me, saying, 'Leave us, you and all the people who follow you.' After that, I will leave." And in hot anger, he left Pharaoh. The Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh will not listen to you in order that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt." Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of his land.
Nice, thank you. And Carol, the last one.
Exodus 12, 29 to 30. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead.
Isn't that just such a happy story? Yeah, what's up with all the livestock too? Taking all the livestock firstborn? Come on. Okay. Oh, shoot.
He wanted to make a clear point.
Yes, and I think we'll get to some of that as to what is the point of this? Where's the connection here? But let's just look. I know I didn't have you read it because it's just so many chapters, but here's I found this little lovely
that is nice
chart. And so you got the 10 plagues, and you may remember them, or not. This is a good little reminder. So the first one is the water of the Nile turning to blood. Frogs then emerging out of the river and just overly populating the banks and dying everywhere. And then it's lice, or the word in Hebrew can mean several different things that pertain to flying, biting little creatures, fleas, that sort of thing. Then it's flies, sort of like, just that show up when there's all this death and whatever destruction, and sick cattle and boils and fire, hail, locusts, and darkness. And, it just sounds like a California summer, doesn't it? And then it's the death of the firstborn is the final plague there. So that's kind of that's the just basically the progression of the 10 plagues. And as you look at these, or as you think about how you've been taught about the 10 plagues previously, do you think these are natural or supernatural or combination? I'd love to hear what's your understanding of the 10 plagues, if you have one. How have you been taught previously about how to appreciate them? Marcia?
I've been taught that they were natural, that you can find something in nature, like the sea turning to red could be that red algae, and
yes,
things like that. And of course we've seen locusts, and darkness can be from a volcano.
It could be
far
from
away.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of us have become aware of that sort of understanding of these plagues, that there's a very natural possible explanation for them. As she said, this red algae, often referred to as red tide, it literally does turn the waters red and makes them unlivable, unsustainable to life. And so it would make sense then that plague number 2 would almost flow out of that anything in there would just want to get out. And then over time, you have overpopulation, there's going to be a lot of dying, which then leads to flying critters, and then flies, and things that bite can make cattle sick. It can also be transferred to humans. See how it goes? There can be this understanding of a progression that are naturally occurring. And many of these plagues still do occur in Egypt, or as Marcia said, really in many places throughout our world. Okay, so a lot of us have been raised with that understanding. Some of us were raised with an understanding that it was more supernatural, that they were reflective of God's particular power. And so we see river of blood, and we were taught to take that at face value, that it was blood. Okay, so some of us have that understanding. But I want to having said that, having addressed or acknowledged that, I would like to ask another question. So let me put that aside for now. And the question is, does it make any difference if we look at the 10 plagues, not so much as some sort of contest between Moses and Pharaoh, but as a contest, kind of like what Ken was alluding to, as a contest between God and Egypt's gods? And how does that change our understanding of these plagues, if at all? If it's not about Moses and Pharaoh so much as Israel's God versus Egyptian gods. How does it change our appreciation of what this is? And I admit that some of this is something you would have to, or not have to, but you might want to, after this class, kind of look into a little bit. But for example, the Nile turning into unlivable blood or red. Egypt had a god of the Nile named Hapi, H-A-P-I. And so there's a satirical element, excuse me one second. Had to close the door because folks are arriving back home. There's a satirical element in these stories, okay? And so if the Nile is made, the Nile was the central, most important water source for Egypt, okay? So to make that unsustainable of life is potentially a satirical way of saying that Israel's God is more powerful than the God of the Nile, Hapi, okay? It's a way of showing that God is, that God doesn't have power. And in much the same way, there's a goddess named Heket, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Heket, who appears in Egypt as a frog. And so you see what I'm saying? So this frog goddess is then shown to be, well, there's a time when the Egyptians came to despise these frogs because they were all dying. It's another illustration in a satirical way, a funny way, by some lens, that shows that God is more powerful. Okay, same thing with the cattle, the fifth plague. The cattle, there's a goddess named Hathor, and again, pronunciation may be off, who is rendered as a cow. And so to show this story, while yes, it could be very natural and it could reflect some of that, but these stories also have this element where they're very much representative of specific Egyptian gods. Perhaps the most satirical then in that light would be the ninth plague, the darkness. A lot of folks believe that this story was originally kind of reflected in the time of Ramses, one of the greatest pharaohs of all time. That's certainly what the movie has it, but a lot of scholars concur. Not that we really know for sure, but it sort of makes sense. But Ramses, the name Ramses means son of Ra, okay, or Amun-Ra as it became later. But Ra is the god of the sun, one of the most powerful gods, if not the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon. So the darkness is the God of Israel's way of showing that even Ra can't stand before God. You see how it works that way? Or it can. It's this satirical approach almost, demonstrating time after time after time that Israel's God is putting Egypt's gods in their place, actually showing how impotent Egypt's gods really are. There are no gods at all in the face of God. Okay. So that's one of the places you can go in looking at these. Again, adding to the idea of it being maybe naturally explainable or even supernatural. The point is, it leads us to a similar result. And that is that the forces of Egypt and the gods of Egypt cannot stand before the God of Israel. Okay. Any questions or comments about that? Had you heard anything like that before? Yeah. Ken's nodding his head. Yeah, I had vague kind of references to some of that, but not really that specific as I was able to kind of find for this class. But I'd heard that, yes, that they could be representations of the way that Israel's God was specifically, kind of defeating other gods, almost like a boxing match throughout each plague. Boys?
I was just curious if there's any evidence that many of the Egyptians kind of took on the Israelite God when that was happening or after it happened.
There's no indication in terms of historical record, and certainly the story really creates a distinct divide there, that it's this constant, and again, this is where, if you read this, it's almost farcical, where it's a constant refrain of Pharaoh saying, okay, I give, just take it away and I'll let you go. And Moses takes away whatever the pain, the consequence from the particular plague. And then all of a sudden, Pharaoh changes his mind and his heart gets hardened, that sort of thing. And it goes back, and he goes back on his word. And then Moses comes back and says, all right, I'm really did this time. And it's almost just this funny, consistent, back and forth that happens 10 times until finally the last one that just finally pushes it over the top. And it's like, all right, I give. But even then he goes back on it, because he chases them out to the Sea of Reeds. So there's that sort of thing. So the way the story presents it, boys, is there's never any indication that anyone of Egypt is sort of discovers sort of an awakening, to the true power of God. And because the point of the story isn't really about Egypt, it's really about Israel. It's about what God's relationship to Israel is in this case. Horty?
I'm not very good in historical accuracy. anywhere, let alone in my own life. So I can't really remember the first time I heard this set of stories, but my emotional response as I try to find that historically in my life is I remember being absolutely certain of the ultimate power of God. It sank into my being. And I don't know whether I was 3 or 4 or 7 or 8, or I don't know, but I know it was a manifestation, an absolute manifestation in my heart in hearing these stories. And whether it happened or not never mattered to me at all. Could it? Sure, God's God. Did it? I don't know. Does it matter? I don't know. I just didn't get caught up in that. But I can, as I said, as I'm trying to remember how this came into my life and when it did, I just feel the powerful presence of the change in my life in hearing them the first time.
Yeah. And I think the storyteller would have loved having you in the audience to hear it that way, because ultimately, you know, it's like the old, with the line we've used many times, the storytellers that say this idea that I don't know if it happened exactly this way, but I know what I'm about to say is true. And there's something that comes through of truth in these stories that goes beyond whether or not they happened historically, factually, exactly that way. And that's the dance of Bible study, truly, is because it ends up being the same, it brings us to that same conclusion, which is what you just named. And that is that these stories convey that it is the God of Israel who is the one who is the most powerful, who is the true liberator, okay? The one who chooses the enslaved, the voiceless, to be their voice, to be their guide, to be with them. Okay, that's the important thing. And if we sometimes, you know, as we've seen, you go down the road of following all the details, and then you focus on trying to build a replica of Noah's Ark, or trying to find where it landed, or try to find out if all these things happened this way or that. Look, that can be interesting, but a lot of times it leads us down dead-end paths, or sometimes rabbit holes that really don't lead us to anything constructive. But, you know, hey, I often find myself in those Dan Brown moments of my life where you're kind of interested in pursuing some of these things. That's okay. I'm not saying don't. I just don't know that those are the focusing on every detail is going to really get you to the point of the story. Okay. For example, when we look at the plagues, and this is what we started talking about this before, there are some things that we find troubling, okay, about the plagues. 2 things that I want to address. One, and we started to address this whole idea of that shift that happens in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, okay? Again, the first 5 plagues, it says very clearly that it's Pharaoh who's hardening his own heart. And then the last 5 plagues, it's the Lord, it's God who is hardening Pharaoh's heart. And I would just like, before I go into some of the things that I might have to say, what do you think that even represents? How would you, I don't know if explaining is the right word, but just how would you make sense of that? What's plausible? What feels plausible to you? Or does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. You know, that's another thing. Maybe it's just, you know, whether it's Pharaoh or God. Marcia?
It reminds me of what Judas did. It was because God, it was all God's plan for Judas to do what he did. And so Jesus says, do what you must do. And so I look at God hardening, because that's what that had to be done in order to have this such a story that Horty changed her life.
Yes, I think that's a really great point, Marcia. And again, Judas is a beautiful example because it's quite, you know, there's some descriptions of Judas that are not quite as Marcia described, but there are a couple, gosh, I forget which one. Is it John? Is it Luke? Where it describes him as more of an instrument of God, even though he's someone that betrays Jesus, the way the story conveys it is that this is what he was here to do. And in that sense, it is, some have understood the role of Pharaoh in this story as really being an instrument of God. And so, again, whether or not God actually did that, the story communicates that God has power over everything. Okay, that idea that God is even capable of using Pharaoh, who thinks he's the most military, mightiest ruler on earth, and he was by the standards of the world at that point. God's even able to use Pharaoh to God's own designs to liberate God's enslaved people. That's a powerful statement, okay? But we need not have a literal understanding of the plagues to reach that conclusion. And that's where, we're sort of playing with these ideas and opening up a little bit.
I just want to say thank you for the historical comparison with the Egyptian gods, because when you asked that question, I thought, well, I don't know anything about the Egyptian gods. So that was really helpful. I really like that very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I do that. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes where it's like I ask a question and I know that outside of someone having, maybe studied classics or mythology in some recent time in their lives, it's not easy to answer these because our Bibles don't often reference anything about that. They don't give us that possible context because the truth is it doesn't necessarily, there's nowhere that says, oh, this is exactly what it means. But the way the stories are written, this mythical, epic style, this kind of, it's wild, it's so dramatic, it's so memorable. It makes, there's a way that it makes sense, that it really fits to communicate the truth in this way that allows for it to be representative of far more than Moses against Pharaoh. No, this is God against Egypt's gods, that idea. And it's all of it. It's all of it. So all I'm trying to do is open our whole appreciation of this story so that it lands even more deeply in us, if it hasn't already, like what Horty was sharing, and just let it kind of percolate in there and see where it takes us. But any other ideas as far as like, what do you think? How do you make sense of this movement of the hardening of Pharaoh's own heart and to God doing it too? Jay?
Well, can it be, getting back to your point before, a sense that Pharaoh, in hardening his heart for the first 5 times, it becomes flipped to where God is saying, no, I'm not done with you yet. I don't want you to give up quite yet. We'll continue on with this. I'm not done with it.
Yeah. And in that sense, it's once again, if we read it through that lens, it's quite funny that Pharaoh is he's already sort of set the standard. And again, let's look at a little bit about this word hardening. It has to do with self-importance. It has to do with stubbornness for sure. I think that's probably what we hear when we hear the word hardened our heart. It's like you get more stubborn, more rooted in your position. But the word in Hebrew also conveys the sense of weight, of heaviness, in the sense of gravitas, of feeling like I don't need to listen to anyone else because I already have all the answers. This idea that Pharaoh is already, I am Pharaoh. And now this I am God is standing before Pharaoh and showing Pharaoh that Pharaoh is not I am at all. That idea. So and again, I think it's intended with the patterns, this kind of repeated pattern, it's intended to kind of come across as somewhat satirical, perhaps even farcical. But there's something that I found that I had never heard before too. And it's also along the lines of these, the sort of Egyptian particular context. And it was so cool, I couldn't help but share it. So the idea of Pharaoh's hardening and also connecting to this sense of the heaviness, and then God stepping in and seemingly, in a sense, utilizing Pharaoh as an instrument, or even judging Pharaoh, as Jay sort of said, and saying, no, you're not getting out of it that easy, buddy. You're gonna stay in this, be in it, okay? You're gonna learn your lesson somehow this way, okay? when you look at the way pharaohs behaved, and this is throughout the period of the Exodus, but also well before this, pharaohs, once they got into power, they spent so much time. The pyramids were built by pharaohs who in their lifetime were building their burial chambers. Okay, now that was before this time. Later, it became building burial chambers buried underground kind of thing, not necessarily pyramids. But the point was, pharaohs, from the time they stepped into power, had this sense of wanting to live lives that would enable them to move into the afterlife with power and glory. Okay, and so what you find in these burial chambers, they were really ornate. They had all this gold and silver and a lot of writings about how the pharaohs were seeming to judge themselves and how they hoped to be judged, because there was this sense of they had to live a right life, a just life by their own determination, by their own characterization, in order to earn afterlife and then deification. Okay, so that was sort of the movement that they had. Well, the writings overall of the pharaohs about that process of moving into the afterlife collectively became known as the Book of the Dead, not the Tibetan Book of the Dead or of Living and Dying. This is the Egyptian, the Book of the Dead. And what's really interesting is there's a story in that Book of the Dead. It's one of the spells, because that's the way they called them. There were spells that enabled entry into the afterlife. It had to do with the pharaoh meeting Osiris. That was the god of the living. Okay, and who would determine how you would transition from this life to the next. And they would take the heart of Pharaoh and they put it on a scale and they would weigh the heaviness of the heart. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. If Pharaoh's heart was deemed too heavy, meaning too hardened, it would be consumed by this other beast, Emmet or Amit, and Pharaoh would be precluded from going further into the afterlife and ever reaching deification. Only when the pharaoh's heart was deemed light enough, just enough, that would be sort of the ticket. And so in a sense, this story of God hardening Pharaoh's heart is a way of conveying God's judgment and the story's judgment of Pharaoh's cruelty. And his hardness of heart was an increasing of the heaviness of his heart, representing that he was sort of hoisting himself on his own petard, which is one of my favorite sayings. That's why I just decided to use it there. But that idea that he is convicting himself, even though it says God is hardening his heart. Pharaoh started the process and he's convicted himself. And all of this story, this repeated pattern, is a way of showing that Pharaoh is not the just one here, is not the powerful one here, is not in control of his ultimate, destiny. And, he's being judged by himself, even as he's being judged by God. I thought that was so cool. I was like, that's wild. I'd never heard that. Now, I don't know if that's certainly it's not the only pathway to understanding or awareness in the story, but what do you think? Kathleen?
Perry and I couldn't understand your favorite expression. Would you say it slowly?
Oh, when you hoist yourself on your own petard? You know that one? So it's like a petard is like a halberd, like a spear. And it's just those people that basically string themselves up by the way they talk or act. They self-convict. That's the idea. That was an expression. It is an old one, but one of my seminary teachers used to use it all the time. And I just was like, that's awesome. I want to keep that one going. Any other comments about that, Bonnie?
The thing that is striking me, I guess it goes back to the time of Joseph, but if you follow, it made me think of Israel and Egypt historically. I remember Jimmy Carter with the Begin and the Sadat, and it's gone on, and of course Sadat was eventually murdered, I guess, but assassinated, but But these two civilizations, if you want to call them, or I don't know if they were countries at that time, have continued throughout history to be opposed to each other. And historically, I mean, and I don't know where God play, you know, you always think of, well, the Jews are the chosen people, and I don't know where that leaves the Muslims, or where that leaves, you know, Egypt and all of that. But it's been thousands of years since this occurred, and you know, there has never been a real lasting peace or agreement between the countries. I mean, temporarily, but it seems like there's still always a battle going on, and I guess it goes way back even before Moses. I don't know. That's just what I was.
There do seem to be indications in these stories of some either measure of antipathy or times of kind of mutuality in their existence. But for the purposes of the Exodus story, it really is less concerned about Israel and more, about Egypt and more concerned about Israel. So this story is really intended to talk about and to convey the images, the meaning, the symbols of the liberation of Israel, and is not so much about a judgment of Egypt for all time. It's certainly a judgment of Pharaoh, and it's certainly a judgment of Egypt's gods, but it's not so much. I mean, yes, it affects all the people, it affects all their livestock, but all their livestock firstborn as well. But it's not necessarily that was the historical factual approach. It could be that is representative of that same, you know, that Pharaoh and Egypt's gods have no power before Israel's God, and that there's nothing that they can do in a world that basically lauds them as the highest and the best, and already deifies Pharaoh, because Pharaoh, you know, they were sort of treated like demigods in their lifetime, and then they'd reach full deification in the afterlife. You know, the world treated them like that, and this story is basically saying, you know, you're not it. So yes, it's true that we can look back historically and connect and see things, and some of those patterns can be instructive. But for our purposes today, this story is not so much concerned with God's sort of ultimate judgment over Egypt for all time. This is more about the liberation of Israel here. But let's look at that last troubling thing, and I promise we'll get to the actual Exodus itself. But the last troubling part that bothers a lot of people is the killing of the firstborn, and that if we look at that from that historical factual place, it sort of leaves God in a position of like, where's God's compassion? And you could almost question God's morality if it's about, you know, killing all these firstborns, because we think of the innocent children, right? So that's where it can be helpful to find other ways of understanding this plague, of that particular plague. And I'd love to just hear in your own sort of faith experience, in your own previous learnings, that particular one, because I've had people come up to me in earnest and say, this really troubles me. How do we make sense of this? In your own life, how have you made sense of that 10th plague in a way that leaves God in a position where God is still worthy of being worshiped? Horty?
In feeling my way through thinking what you're asking, I guess it came down to me, rather than how bad is God, God gives life and God can take it away. That's the nature of that power. And once again, it didn't matter to me whether it was something that actually happened.
Yeah.
But it was about God's infinite capability.
Okay. Yeah, and again, that capability can relate to the individual acts, and that can be helpful. But it also, the capability that we've been talking about, the capability of God to demonstrate power that is above and beyond any of Pharaoh's power or Egyptian God's power. Okay, rendering them impotent to show that God is the true God, that sort of thing. Any other ways that you have kind of found your way through that last plague for understanding? Marcia, excuse me.
Might it be, okay, and I'm not getting the true facts. Pharaoh thought that, there were too many Israelites, and so he said all the firstborn boys were going to get killed, and that's why Moses got put in a basket, hoping that his life would be saved, correct?
Yeah, roughly.
Okay, is this a reaction to, okay, you had all these Israelites babies killed. I'll do that and up it one.
Yeah. There is a one-upmanship that I do think it communicates. But how do you find, so is that just it, that gives you that sort of, does that help you through the whole story, or does that still leave you with questions?
Well, I think I'm like with Horty. It's like, I don't know if this is a literal story, but God can do what he or she does, whatever.
Yeah.
But it was, it didn't come out of nowhere. That's what, I mean, and it happens with Jesus too, all these.
Well, that story connects well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To the Moses story, for sure. That is what that refers to. And the fact that Joseph puts Mary on a donkey to go to Egypt, when they have to flee to Egypt. That's exactly what Moses does. And so you've got gospels like Matthew and even John that utilize the Moses imagery and put Jesus in the role of the new Moses. And you'll see that connection all the time, for sure.
And so is there something in this literature of killing of the firstborn, and you go back to Abraham, it's, I forget the word I'm trying to say, but sacrificing his firstborn.
Right.
So maybe there's something to, we're looking at, this little baby's getting killed and this little animal's getting killed. But maybe there's something higher to this whole thing about killing the firstborn.
I think so. I think you're onto something, Marcia. And I think anyone who has, if you've read anything about, ancient Egyptian history, there is very little, if no kind of information about something like this actually happening, a slaughtering of the firstborn like that. It's not, so it's very difficult to corroborate that particular plague, the statements of that. But as Marcia pointed out, it is very much a theme that is repeated throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Hebrew Bible. So it bears looking at what is it used for? What does it accomplish? And I think that's a helpful approach in looking at these plagues, in that let's spend less time in the details, in the weeds, so to speak, and more time looking at, all right, just look at the overall picture and what was the result of each of these plagues, and in particular, the last one, which was the final straw. The last one is an over-the-top exhibition that not only creates in Pharaoh a willingness to let them go, but what does it also say? They give them supplies, they give them gold, they give them silver, they basically give them everything so that they'll leave. And in certain lenses, again, if we remove ourselves from the factual aspect, it's quite funny. It's just over the top. And again, as a campfire story, what you have is 10 plagues of dramatic, a wonderful imagery, unforgettable imagery that lead to an unforgettable story. And of course you want it to be unforgettable because they're telling it orally. You know, they want it, it has to convey, it has to communicate the power of God through all things. So I would simply argue that while we can't definitively say this never happened, it's definitely not historical, I would not go that far, but I would say that we are best helped through these stories to find that path that says, look, Moses was most likely a real person, and this idea of liberation and the connection between God and Israel is real. I don't know if it happened exactly this way, but the truth of this story is that God acts on behalf of God's people. God picks the ones that the world forgets, and God demonstrates power beyond anything the world understands. That kind of thing. You know, and there's more to it than that. But ultimately, that's where these plagues lead us. They lead us to this unbelievable, everything being flipped on its head. To have Pharaoh finally come to this is just like, wow, okay. It happened, all right? And so after that plague, the last, is there anyone else that wants to speak to the last plague at all? Because I was going to move into the Exodus finally. Boyce.
It seems like the killing of the firstborn, I think many times the firstborn were more important than any others in the family. They inherited everything. And it's almost like Israelites became the firstborn of God, and they inherited all this stuff as they're being kicked out of Egypt.
I think you nailed it, Boyce, because in fact, Exodus chapter 4 says as much. It calls Israel the firstborn of God. And what you're saying, what you're noticing is that action of Pharaoh and the Egyptians giving them all that stuff is a form of like kind of bequeathal. It's an inheritance. It's a way of kind of communicating that despite the cruelty of Egyptian slavery, God finds a way to validate, to liberate, to validate the relationship between Israel and God, and to liberate the people through their inheritance as God's firstborn. So there really are lots of ways to connect to these stories, you know, beyond the historical. Marcia?
It's like Pharaoh acknowledges that the Israelites are the firstborn.
Yes, exactly. And that's another demonstration of God's power. Exactly. Marcia?
And along with that, if they weren't being killed all that night, you know, the whole idea of, you know, the blood of lamb, you know, over their door, saves them. I mean, the imagery of what's to come is, I mean, it would have to be, how are you going to save your house by the blood if things aren't happening out there?
Well, it's a powerful image, isn't it? This idea of the lamb, and it's something that became then the symbolic rendering of this story. That whenever they told the story of the Passover, they enacted the Passover lamb, the paschal lamb, and spreading of the blood with a branch of hyssop that's very specific. And it's very interesting because when you look at John, the Gospel of John, at the end, when Jesus is crucified, it is a branch of hyssop that they lift to his lips when they try to give him the wine. Okay, so there's connections here. There's connections to these stories. But let's before we get to some of those connections between this being the Jewish redemption story and perhaps the Christian redemption story, let's look at the actual Exodus itself. And I want to see if we look at the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, okay, as if we focus less on the details of that, oh my gosh, it was low tide or all that, and don't worry about the details, and more focusing on the crossing as a contest once again between God and the greatest military force of all time. How does that alter our understanding of it? What does this story communicate? because Pharaoh sends out his 600 best chariots, the elite, okay? Like the Blue Angels of the Air Force or Navy. Is that Navy? Shoot, yeah, Navy. The Blue Angel, like just the top of the top. And these are the ones that come out to meet the Israelites at the shores of the Sea of Reeds, okay? And God takes care of business. How does it alter your understanding when you see it as not so much, again, Moses against Pharaoh, but God against Pharaoh's military might? How does God do it? Does God actually create? Is it a violent overthrow? How do you remember that it happens? Horty and then Bonnie.
God parts the waters. He separates the thing that seems impassable and creates a dry pathway. It's not even a muddy pathway. It's
Right.
a dry pathway.
It's very explicit that it's dry, as if it was just completely dry.
Yeah.
And because they're on foot, they just walk across. And then it says that Pharaoh's chariots, with their heaviness, get stuck in the mud. And then the waters come back and they're swamped. They're taken over. So it's not a violent story, is it? In a sense of God doesn't send angels down to smite anybody. It's that it's Pharaoh's perceived might is thwarted by a God who uses something that is almost like, it's just, you don't really think of it as anything. It's not your typical display of power. We'll say that. This is just a dramatic and wild way to take care of Pharaoh's army. And do the Israelites do anything? Do they do anything to defeat Pharaoh's army?
They
No.
walk away.
Yeah, you know what? They cross. They do cross. So they follow the instructions. They follow the path, but they do nothing. They have no interaction with Pharaoh's elite army.
Yeah.
It is God that is the one that is displayed, as having that sort of power over. And again, it kind of continues the theme, doesn't it? The Egyptian gods can't stand, Pharaoh can't stand. The definition of military might and authority that the world has cannot stand. These are themes that the New Testament picks up very specifically, especially in the stories of Jesus, whether it's his birth or his life. Jesus' interaction with Caesar is a proxy for Pharaoh. These ways that the world's power is shown to be impotent, even in the face of death, what the world thinks is the worst it can offer, God still redeems. These are the themes of the stories that we see. And that's why it's so good to get into this story, to get our elbows deep into that mud of the Sea of Reeds itself, so that we can really appreciate once again how all these images come back to play. So let's do play with it a little bit. What are some of the parallels that you can see between the Passover, like the 10 plagues Passover Exodus story, that redemptive story of Judaism, and the redemptive story of Christ in the New Testament, our redemptive story? What are some of the parallels that you see? No, it's a lot. It's a lot to think about. But you probably have heard, I believe it's in the Gospel of John, that Jesus is called the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. That idea is directly connected to the Passover lamb. Okay, that idea that Jesus serves that role. The church picked up on that rather quickly. What are some other themes? What are some other connections that you can find? I named the one where in Matthew, Joseph puts Mary and the child on a donkey so they can flee to Egypt. And that's exactly what Moses does. What
I
other
have to
place?
break in with a moment of humor. And that is when Moses put all his family on a donkey. It's like when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on 2 donkeys
Yeah.
on the mother of the colt. And it just,
Right.
that came right to my mind as I read, how did he get all his sons on that one donkey?
Uh-huh. There's an element of farce in that. And there's also an element that the person who wrote that story did not understand Hebrew poetry very well to think that they were trying to say it was 2 creatures like that. To have Jesus actually riding on 2 beasts is quite funny, but also works, because that whole act of riding a donkey into the city is a way of saying, you know what, Caesar with his war horses and all his power, he can just go, whatever, take a short leap off a tall, I don't know what the expression is there. He can go hoist himself on his own petard. But it's a way of sort of almost satirically turning all the pictures of what is might, what is power, what is authority on its head. Okay. And they use the imagery of Moses and the Exodus to great effect throughout the Gospels. Any other areas of connection that you can see or that you can recall in the Jesus story and the Moses story here? Yes, Jane. You're muted. You're still muted, Jane. I'm sorry. You need to unmute. Yeah.
So I said the shepherd-like qualities of Moses and Jesus and even the whole idea of the staff or the walking stick and just they were both, God used both of them in their lives to lead the people.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That shepherd theme is a huge one. Absolutely. Good. Any other places of connection? Susan.
I was thinking of the fact that Aaron spoke for Moses and Jesus spoke for God.
Yes, and we'll actually come back to that connection, because I love what you said there. The whole relationship of Aaron and Moses, and how that connects to Jesus and some of the people in his ministry and his life and his connection to God, as opposed to or in relation to how Aaron and Moses, how that story communicates their connection to God. There's a lot to that. But yeah, there's good connection there for sure. What about like the idea that the Exodus, the people didn't have to do anything. They sort of just followed the path. There's an element of grace in the Exodus story, that it's God's power, that it's God's choosing of them. God chose them and they chose to say yes. So there's that beautiful connection, but there's a distinct element of grace in the Exodus story that is also quite powerfully present in the stories of Jesus and his willingness to sacrifice himself for the sake of those he loved. So that element of grace is also present in both. Any other elements you can see that connect both the Exodus and the Jesus stories, boys?
It seems like Moses going to the burning bush and Jesus having gone to the wilderness is kind of similar.
Yeah, the movement of Moses out to the wilderness, where he discovers who he is and what his true relationship to God is very much paralleled in Jesus being sent immediately out into the wilderness at the beginning of his ministry. Absolutely, that's another connection to Moses. Good. Anything else bubbling up? It's these things that will continue to come up again as you continually deepen your awareness of the symbols and the themes and the power of the Exodus story. It'll start to pop up in so many different ways, many of which you've seen before, but there's always some new ones that come up, and that's, I find, exciting when you notice some of those connections. Yes, Boyce.
Also, Moses, when he leaves the palace and goes out, he sees the real world and gets angry, kills somebody. Jesus goes to the church and sees what's going on, and he gets angry.
Yeah, absolutely. So look at some of the parallels and see how that then how that connects. I think you will find some connections there, that created a lot of tension between the powers that be and Moses that forced him to flee. And in Jesus' case, it was utilized at the end of his life, although in John, it's not. It happens earlier. But it's utilized as a means of sort of last straw, that's what causes the crucifixion to happen, even though it's probably cause is not the right word. That's sort of the last thing that happens that then moves Jesus toward that. So yeah, this is good. And it's not just an academic exercise. To notice these connections is to notice how the ancient storytellers and gospel writers were crafting their story. Because again, if Jesus serves as the new Moses, then all of these symbolic parts of Jesus' story will then naturally connect in one way or another to the Moses tradition, to these Exodus stories. And it's always fruitful to see where that happens and then to play with the idea of why, or what's it trying to communicate? What is it showing me here? Beyond the face value aspect, okay? That's where Bible study gets just really like, it's good stuff. Any other comments on these parallels that we've been talking before we come to the last part? Yes, Jane.
This isn't a parallel, but before we close, this is really troubling to me. And I know it's told in reference to Israel's history, mythology, story, faith, and all that. So it's really written, like you said, we're not about the Egyptians. It's not.
Yeah.
But what about all these civilizations and cultures from back then and now? What if you're not born into a tradition that believes in God and has a sense of any kind of God? I mean, I'm just thinking, it doesn't have to be my Christian God, but I mean, is it really so true that God has chosen people, chosen children? And why is he not concerned about liberating people spiritually? I mean, why is there nothing that he wants to liberate the Egyptians spiritually, that they would come to him? It just seems, is it because it is written for the Israel, for their Torah?
You're touching on something that I think is so important. And I would even argue, and again, this is something for each of us to kind of come to on our own, in our own faith assessment journey, whatever. But in the New Testament, I do look at Jesus kind of being the new Moses as taking it a step or two further, that where the Exodus was about Israel, the liberative story of Jesus is about all creation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that the way the gospel writers craft the story, it's to nudge it or to dramatically move it in that direction. And so if you take the whole arc of the scriptural tradition, it is a progression towards that very thing. But you're right to say that in the context of Israel's self-conception at the time, and that the fact that this was written in Babylon, where it really did matter that Israel's identity needed to be preserved, stories like this of powerful action on the part of God on behalf of Israel and liberation was so vital, because they're at a place where they may be gone. Okay, it could have gone completely different. So to call to mind that liberative power of God was to call people back to this idea of, all right, well, let's trust that again. Let's go back to our homeland to create this promised land that God has had us moving toward for generations, and that we've touched on but haven't fully realized. Because the truth about Babylon is the people who were taken there, it wasn't a bad life. This is the thing. They weren't living in squalor, but they were living in forgetfulness over time. That when you're there generations, people lose track, they lose connection to what was. And they're just in this cosmopolitan reality. That's how Babylon did it. It was a wonderfully cosmopolitan place. They took the elites, they took the merchants, they took the artisans, they took the people that could add something to their culture. But what happens is when you're in that type of a setting, you're just going to naturally kind of have this meshing of all these different cultures, and you lose something of your identity. So these stories call them back to that place of re-identifying, reconnecting with God, and to a sense of homeland, of geography as connected to their story, rather than that wandering identity that was so important for, that was so important for the 40 years of wandering in the desert, with the Moses story that's to come. So it is so good and important to notice where those distinctions happen. But I do think there's room in the overall storytelling, the arc of the New Testament, that it does move it to a broader, more universal inclusion of salvation. But here's the thing, Jane, some would argue with that. Some Christians would argue with that, say, no, it is exclusive. And I would disagree. But this is where, depending on our upbringing or our theology or our approach to some of these stories, some people make different, comments. They say, well, sorry, the Jews had their chance and now it's on to the Gentiles. I don't see that. I don't see the Jews ever being forsaken. If you're abusive in the way you read the stories, and I don't mean to be dismissive, I'm not trying, but I'm just trying to speak. It's all just, coming out right now. But it never forsakes the Jews. It sort of opens it up to others as well.
Mm-hmm.
So let's, as Susan indicated, let's look at Aaron and Moses, and just kind of when you think about that little paragraph that Perry read about Aaron and his role in the story, what were their roles in the story, and how did Aaron's and Moses' roles seem to complement one another? What did Aaron do in that paragraph? Maybe I'll call it up again, because let's just take a look. Hello, plagues. Okay. This second paragraph here, this is kind of where he goes out to the wilderness to meet Moses. And then what does Aaron do? And is it important? How is it important? I'm giving you a moment to read it. I think you're probably all doing that. I'm going to just spend another couple seconds on this, and I'm going to go back so I can see all your faces in case someone has their hand up, because in this, I can't see everybody. Hello. Okay, so what do you think? What did Aaron do there? Ken?
He really served as a bridge between Moses and the rest of the people.
No question. The story doesn't give us a ton of details, but it's quite clear that Aaron's got some sway with the people there. And, Moses tells Aaron what happened, and then Aaron is the one that speaks to the people. Aaron's the one that does the talking. He gathers the elders of Israel. That's a crucial role. That's basically, the one that sort of says, all right, here's what's what. Are you in? Basically, that's it. Because if they weren't all in, none of this would have happened. This is another one of those steps, isn't it? That's just these little ways that these characters perform these roles. So like a lot of good priests, Aaron's good at talking. And then Moses, like a lot of good prophets, is good at acting, good at action. He's a man of conviction, even with his self-doubt and some of the other quirks of his personality, his stuttering, speech and all that. Yes, Horty.
I was struck by the fact that it says, to me anyway, what I read was that Aaron said verbatim, he used all the words and he used all the signs. So he did not take any artistic license in the translation of the message that God gave to Moses. It was very accurate, and it felt to me like very verbatim.
Yeah, he said it as it was. That's the way the story kind of communicates it. So he really very much speaks for Moses And by extension, Aaron is speaking for God to the people. So it's a very powerful role that if you just read that paragraph quickly, Aaron goes out and meets him, gives him a kiss, goes and they gather the people together, and then, things keep going. You can easily kind of gloss over some of these things. But really, these characters, from the beginning of Moses' story, there have been character after character after character who have small but crucial roles in forwarding the story of God. And here's what you notice. You probably have already noticed this, but maybe have never articulated it this way. Almost always in Scripture, when God calls someone to do something, God also either calls or provides someone or someone's a community to help it happen, right? So you've got Moses with not only Aaron, but you've got Miriam, you've got Pharaoh's daughter, you've got Zipporah, that really peculiar story where God's like, they're walking back from to Egypt, and God is going to kill him because you don't know who the him is. Could be Moses' firstborn. There's a lot of conjecture, but it's this whole foreskin thing. He's not circumcised. And God threatens. And Zipporah, Moses' wife, acts decisively and quickly to rectify the situation. Okay, there's another one, Zipporah. And I'm just touching on that one because I didn't include that. There's just too many of these wonderful, rich details. But people are put in place to help the prophet or the one that's called achieve God's way. And look at how often it happens. David had Jonathan and Joab and so many different people come in and help him along the way. Jesus had 12 disciples. And then when Jesus sent them out to do the ministry, the work, they were always sent out in pairs. You see, Paul had Barnabas, Silas, Timothy, Titus, Luke, all these different people. Almost always when God calls one, God calls many. And it's the actions of the community that help the story go forward. Without all of it, there's a point where it could have broken. It could have stopped. And that's what's amazing. And that's what's amazing about the way the story is crafted. Any closing comments for today? That's what I have basically to carry us through the Exodus story, the 10 plagues, the Passover. Any other closing comments or unresolved questions that you might have? Well, go ahead, boys.
Your favorite saying is very similar to give somebody enough rope and they'll hang themselves. And I look at that and I think that's what's happening with Putin.
Oh, I know. There's so many corollaries, right? With not just with authoritarians like him, that sort of have that Pharaoh kind of hardness of heart, or the apparent hardness of heart. There's a lot of corollaries, I think, that we can find. Well, as always, it's a rich class. It's a lot of material. Thanks for hanging in there with me. And thank you for your contribution, your passion.
Horty has something.
I thought she was waving. Okay, go ahead, Horty. Sorry.
So long. It's been good to know you. I wanted to say, Dan, and I've said this to you before, that particularly over the last couple of years, what has come through your words to all of us in service, in our services, has been the sense that the church is community, that it's not the building, it's not you, it's not a liturgy, it's not our denomination. But I think you've really continually emphasized that it's each other, and it's what we do when we go out from there. But it's the sense that we can draw from community. And you just concluded this series with that exact same message. And I just wanted to bring it all back around.
Yes, that is the idea. And that theme is re-emphasized time and again. You're right, because maybe before 3 weeks ago, you thought of the Exodus as being all about Moses. But what we've seen is it's simply not. It's simply not. There's so many other vital characters that carry the story with him and sometimes for him in order to achieve the purposes of God. And we must always bear that in mind.
So thank you for the gift.
You're welcome. Thank you for receiving it. And we still have 3 weeks left of this. So we've still got up through 6. So next week's chapter, 4th session, it's a little bit lighter reading. It's Exodus chapter 19, verses 3b to 6a. So for those that may not know, when you have a B in a verse, it means the second half of verse 3 to all the way through the first half of verse 6. And you'll see what it means. Sometimes there's a sentence that ends there. And then it's chapter 20, verses 1 to 17. I will be posting the notes on the church website. Hopefully that's been, I haven't checked last week since I went.
No, I was
away
going to
for a
ask
few
you if
days.
you could, will we be able to get the notes from last week? Because they never came up and.
Okay, yeah, and I know that was, and Scott, he
had a lot going on.
he had a lot going on, yeah.
But
So
I just don't
yeah,
want it
I
to get
apologize
ignored.
for that, but yeah, we'll make sure they're all up. Okay, friends, enjoyed it as always. Be blessed. Till next week. Bye-bye.